Technology is always a double-edged sword, right? You could use it for good or for bad. And the forces of control right now, they sometimes want to paint Bitcoin as this negative thing that's only used for illicit activities.
Hey folks, Patrick Francie here, host of my YouTube podcast, The Everyday Millionaire and The Everyday Millionaire Mindset Matters. I'm inviting you to listen in today on my conversation with my guest, Natalie Brunell, who is a renowned expert and very highly sought after speaker because she's known for her expertise in the Bitcoin space. And we are going to be talking Bitcoin today. Before we get started, YouTube listeners, please, I only ask a simple, polite request that you subscribe, that you like, hit that like button, make some comments, let us know what you think of the show. Again, let's get those algorithms fired up so I can get a more amazing guest such as Natalie to give you great content. Now, Natalie is a podcast host. She's an educator. She's a media commentator, as well as a video contributor to Bitcoin Magazine. Her popular YouTube show, Coin Stories, links in the description below, features interviews with some of Bitcoin's greatest thought leaders, and she digs into their backgrounds and their conviction for Bitcoin. Now, previously to all of that, Natalie was an award-winning TV journalist and investigative reporter. She spent over 10 years and covered in-depth local and national news topics, and she holds an Emmy for breaking news coverage. In this conversation today, she lays the foundation for the importance of learning about Bitcoin and why in our economic and geopolitical environment today, Bitcoin offers a hedge against the changing monetary policies and the fiat currency in general. I absolutely love this conversation. It wasn't nearly long enough, but I'm going to have Natalie back on the show. But in the meantime, listen in, enjoy. Natalie Brunell, welcome to the show. Nice to speak with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, we met very briefly at the Vancouver Resource Show, and I twisted your arm a little bit, kind of talked you into coming on the show, and I'm really glad you did, and hopefully you're going to be glad you did, because we've got a great audience that want to hear your message. Now, having said that, your bio, and it's always with the guests, it never does it justice, so I like to enter the conversation in this point when somebody walks up and says, "So Natalie, what do you do?" What's your answer to that question?
Well, I never thought I would say this, but I am an independent podcast host and content creator specifically focused on Bitcoin education and financial literacy.
Now, tell me a little bit about that journey, because you're quite young and you started this whole journey of podcasting and getting that message out. Wasn't that long ago, is my understanding of it. And give me a little bit of that background.
Sure. So podcasting started as a hobby for me. I really liked the medium because you can get so much more context in long form interviews. And I am a journalist by training. I worked in mainstream news for more than 10 years. I studied journalism both in undergrad and grad school. And I was a investigative journalist and anchor for most of my career. So at the heart of it, really a storyteller. But if you're familiar with television news, you probably know that if you see a reporter on camera, their stories are typically around 90 seconds or so. And what's interesting is you will work all day, if not multiple weeks, to put on a story that's just a couple minutes long. So imagine all of the interviews, the research that goes into it to just boil it down to a couple of minutes of airtime. And obviously a lot is left on the cutting room floor, and you don't get to share those full interviews in the way that maybe allows someone to let the story breathe a little bit more and learn a little bit of the history or context. So I would seek out longer form interviews. I was always interested in them. And I loved the interviewing aspect of my job, getting to know someone, getting to know the story better. And so when I developed a passion and hunger for learning more about Bitcoin, I thought, what greater medium to express that than to do long form interviews and share them in case anyone else was interested too. So I fell into the world of podcasting sort of accidentally because I consumed a lot and it was just a passion project. And now I'm really grateful that I was able to leave a very stable journalism career to pursue this full time.
So that's awesome. And I want to just pull on that thread a little bit. And I want to talk about Bitcoin, of course, but I want to talk a little bit about the journalism aspect of what you used to do and how you view it today. Now, here's my observation. I watch zero mainstream media, and that really is driven by the fact that in my world, there is no such thing as investigative journalism anymore. What I'm seeing, at least in Canada, and I know that your experience in the US may be a lot different, but from my perspective, I'm looking at talking head script readers that, if it doesn't matter what channel I'm in, it's some version of the same script. Now, that is very negative, but that's how I feel about it, because there's not really investigative journalism that's happening. We're not having journalists, perhaps like you were in the past, kind of going, no, I want to unpack this a little bit more, asking tough questions and actually bringing a story, or in your case, like you say, trying to bring a story to the audience with more than 90 seconds to kind of unpack it, as you would talk about. So when you look at a journalism the way it is today, and this will lead into Bitcoin, by the way, when you look at it, how do you see it? Am I out to lunch in that opinion that I've formed?
No, I don't blame you at all for those feelings. And I definitely ended up with some of them as well throughout my career. But let me ask you a question real quick. Did you always feel that way? Or maybe a couple decades ago, did you feel like, yes, you could actually trust, or maybe you wanted to consume things like television news?
Yeah, it's a great question. There was a time certainly in my life where, yeah, it was, number one, it was the real kind of only source per se. And then when you look at what was happening on the internet, even as little as 10 years ago, 8 years ago, I was still there. But I would say probably about 10 years ago, I just started drifting away from mainstream media as the internet grew, and as there started to be voices that I could hear that was outside of the narrative that was being played out, in fact, on mainstream media. Then, of course, when the pandemic hit, boom, you're going, okay, like as soon as that happened, I have my own views of it. I was calling bullshit on it right away. But my point is that when I started watching it, when I did listen to, just to find out what was the narrative going out into the general public, because I couldn't understand some of the reactions of people, I went, oh, isn't this interesting? So my point is, I totally checked out about 4 years ago, and that's where I'm at today.
Well, again, I completely understand. When I was growing up, I had a great admiration and respect for the industry. I dreamt of working in journalism. I thought that it was a very noble career. I thought that it would give me the opportunity to basically be paid to learn and to, interview prominent figures, be on the front lines of history, and hold people accountable, especially the powerful. And as I entered the profession, I realized that there was a shift happening, especially when things were starting to go digital, and the revenue model, the business model for the news organizations was changing, and there was more competition. And I started to become a little disillusioned by the fact that I agree. I think there should be a strong base layer of rigorous investigative journalism at the very core, and people who have the time to follow public records, follow the money, develop sources. But obviously, you could probably imagine that expends a lot of resources, with maybe something being produced a year or 2 years down the road. And you need television every single day. So the priority was, again, kind of the short term, shorter stories, quick turnarounds, especially as they were starting to compete. The networks were starting to compete more with online avenues. And all of a sudden, by the time I entered the journalism industry, which was about 2009, reporters were now also editors. They were live camera operators. They were producers. They were doing everything themselves, but getting paid about a fifth of what people were getting paid just a decade or two ago. And what I noticed was that more and more networks were starting to become a little bit too friendly in some ways with political forces, with agencies that they were, again, supposed to be holding accountable. Instead of them questioning press releases and information they would put out, it seemed like that was just de facto fact. And there wasn't this sense of questioning and skepticism that I really grew up with. I mean, my parents are first generation immigrants from a communist country. So you could probably imagine how skeptical they were of anything coming out of the media, just by their nature. And it was really disappointing because I had some stories, not in every place that I worked, but I had some stories censored, or they weren't able to air. They were going to ruffle too many feathers, sometimes feathers of very important people. And so I really did start to question the heart of the industry and the intentions, and where the money was flowing, and whether things were just about access to political forces as opposed to holding them accountable and being a watchdog. And that's one of the reasons I think I'm really grateful for being able to go off on my own, because the internet, while it in some ways sort of destroyed the old journalism model, it also reawakened it, because now people can compete with these mainstream, gatekeepers, and allow for more information to be available to people to find on their own. And the truth will come out. Like, maybe you have to dig a little harder to find it, but there are people who are telling the truth, and it's incumbent upon us to make sure to do our homework and not just trust one avenue of information. And so I think it's really powerful that we have that decentralization now of media and journalism, and hopefully, the cream sort of rises to the top. And I think we're seeing that with some of the independent content creators.
It's so important, and I'm such a huge fan of the independents that come out and show up responsibly. Again, in Canada, we look, we call it state-funded media, government funded, where some of our biggest media establishments are actually, really getting some form of check from the government to support it. And, in that regard, I mean, you're not going to bite the hand that feeds you. And so there is, I'm sure, behind the scenes conversations being had between the politicians that are funding some of these organizations, and what can be said and what shouldn't be said. And it really becomes, it really is just not worth listening to anymore, because you're not getting the full story, number one. They don't go deeper, number two. And so why bother listening? If you're looking for information, and as a business guy, I've been an entrepreneur for over 40 years. So, I'm looking for all sorts of relevant information so that I can make good business decisions. And I can't count on mainstream to do that. But interesting, as we go along with all of this, we just, my wife Stephanie and I just dropped a podcast, and we did a kind of a play on words, and we called it, the podcast, The New Word Order, which is to say that when we look at, and how this connects to journalism, is we look at all the things that, these are new phrases and terms that we haven't really used in the past. You think about misinformation and disinformation, all those words that existed, and now all of a sudden they're front and center. We hear about the woke and the awake and all of these terms and terminology, but if you look at mainstream media, none of that shows up in any other way than it's got to be negative. It's going against the grain. And, I can't imagine how frustrating it is for you, who's fired up about uncovering and getting to the truth and getting to the bottom of a story, and then only discover that, oh yeah, no, that's a little bit harsh. I think we need to just back off that a little bit and not show it. But it also speaks to the shift and the change in what's happening at a global level. We hear the term New World Order, we hear the term the Great Reset, we start to all of a sudden are talking about monetary policy. Even the thought of even the term monetary policy wasn't into anybody's awareness, really, unless you were quite astute and into it. Now everybody's starting to understand what it means. Not everybody, far more people are starting to understand. So when you look at the Great Reset, you start to talk about central bank digital currency and having a global central bank. These are all things that are unfolding before us. And if there isn't individuals like you that are actually telling stories and interviewing. I just caught on the weekend, I was out, we live on 5 acres of land. I'm out doing some yard work, getting some fresh air and some exercise. And I listened to your podcast with Colonel Douglas McGregor. And I'm a big fan, and you did a great job, by the way. And
Thank
he's
you.
awesome. What a great interview. And
Really interesting.
I love the maturity he brings and the background he brings, because this is a guy, he's a real deal. He's got huge history. He's freaking smart, yet he's so current with what's happening today. And I know that you and him were talking about Bitcoin. So what is this really for me? One of the reasons I wanted you to have on the show is to talk about Bitcoin the way you talk about it, because you're very good at it. We start to understand that there is a shifting global order, a shifting dynamic. Monetary policy is shifting. All of these things happening, and people are looking at Bitcoin. And I'm going to pass it to you in a minute, but I have to say this. If I hear one more person say that Bitcoin is about illegal blah, 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 drugs, whatever their story is. It's all underground money. I'm going, are you freaking kidding me? You know, fiat currency, cash, plane loads of it flew across back and forth the border with drugs, with illegal arms, with illegal lots of things. Cash was the source. So to say that, oh, Bitcoin is worse than cash would be, well, it's just not true, but that's my view of it. But I want to pass it to you. So when you look at Bitcoin, you got turned onto it for whatever reason. I would like to hear how it came into your awareness and why you've become such a proponent of, we got to get the word out there. Bitcoin, you need to own some.
Yeah, it was a journey for me because when I started to learn about Bitcoin, I realized how much I didn't know about the financial system and the plumbing, how money printing worked, how fractional reserve banking worked, and how much that really impacted all of our interactions within our society. And so for me, it was a transformative experience going down the rabbit hole because I really started to appreciate what the problem is with our broken money and what it's led to in terms of broken incentives and the concentration of power and control, and that we do actually have a potential solution. Technology is always a double-edged sword, right? You could use it for good or for bad. And the forces of control right now, they sometimes want to paint Bitcoin as this negative thing that's only used for illicit activities. And you could argue the same thing for a knife or a car or any piece of technology, right? You could have horrible things online, but at the same time, you could create wonderful websites and things online. So you really have to look at the source of the information. And right now, I think we are at this inflection point where the forces of control, the people in power, the policymakers, are coming into contact with this great force of freedom. And Bitcoin is, I think, one of the ultimate tools for freedom because it is a form of money that isn't issued by any entity. It is completely decentralized. It is immune from control and manipulation. And we haven't had a form of money like this in a very, very long time. We were on a gold standard at one point, but all of that eventually got concentrated and centralized and papered over, right, on top of it, and then derivatives. And we really can't trust that system anymore. And gold doesn't make sense for a digital world. You can't transport it at the speed of light. It's not easy to audit and verify. We need a digital form of money that we can actually trust, that empowers us to not have to trust anyone at all, right? No nation state, no corporation, no business. And that's the real potential and promise of Bitcoin, is being able to reorient a global economy with a base layer unit that is free from control and manipulation. And unfortunately, right now with technology, the people who are in power, they want to use it in order to enact more and more surveillance and control and monitoring, right? And that's what we have with our current fiat system. Not only can they print as much money as they want, but they also are able to see every single transaction and go after people and try to extract from them. Whereas Bitcoin does offer this opportunity to return to a sense of sovereignty, and it is similar to digital cash, right? The last time that we had a form of money that wasn't as easily tracked, it was cash. It was a bearer instrument. And if I paid it to Bob, I mean, no one's in the middle of that transaction taking a cut of it or surveilling it. It's just from me to the person I want to do business with. Bitcoin offers that opportunity to do it again. And so a lot of governments don't like it, right? They want to be able to extract taxes. They want to be able to see where the money's moving, who has it. And I think that this is going to be sort of the great conflict of the next 10 years, because as we move into more of a multipolar world where nations aren't trusting each other and they're slowly moving off this dollar standard because all we do is print money and go further into debt, I think that Bitcoin is going to be one of those tools that some nation states completely resist or they try to control, while others embrace because they see it as a great opportunity, especially in places like developing nations. So it's going to be really interesting to see how all of this plays out. But what I'm so excited about is people need to be economically empowered. They are being stolen from every single day with no vote that they made, that they cast for inflation. They keep expanding these monetary units, and they can do it with any kind of fiat currency. Every government can do this, right? But America has the most power, being the global reserve currency with all the demand there is for dollars around the world, and most debt being denominated in dollars. We can now move ourselves peacefully, opt into this system that is based on real value, that is based on proof of work, that is based on the law of physics. You can't cheat the system. You can't just print more Bitcoin. And I think that that will allow us to engage with one another economically in a more fair way, where the most value is created, as opposed to the people closest to the money printer benefiting and becoming wealthier and wealthier at the expense of everybody else, enslaving everybody else.
Man, so much to talk about. When we look at what's going on, where do I want to take this? I'm going to give you an example. So when you look at Bitcoin and you get into it, and all of what you said, totally I get and I align and I'm aware of. But I want to ask you this question. And I know that part of what your goal is to get the message out there, and particularly to that age category that you're at, but everybody in general. But I'm going to give you an example. So I'm talking to my nieces and nephews who are in that kind of 40-ish age range, 38, 40, 41 kind of thing. And I'm talking to very astute young men and women. And we got into a conversation about what's going on. And I'm kind of that weird Uncle Patrick that talks about this kind of stuff. And I said to them, I go, are you familiar with CBDC? Now, this was just 12 months ago. Are you familiar with the term CBDC, central bank digital currency? Their answer is no. I have no idea. What is it? So I went on to explain what the plan was with central bank digital currency, and they're going, I don't get it. And what's the big deal anyways? I don't carry cash. And I go, do you understand the length or the depth of control that they can have because they're seeing everything you got? They don't seem worried about it. Now, so the question I ask is because you have to go on a journey of understanding to some level monetary policy. You have to go on the journey of understanding to some degree of the history of fiat currency, what it is that when we look at government control, what that really means. Now, because I've done a lot of work in China, plus I have good friends in China. I mean, they are the epitome of government control and using technology to control. In China right now, if you jaywalk, they will pick you up with a camera. They will catch you jaywalking. They will literally debit your account for that jaywalking fine, and you get a mark on your social credit score. All happens in real time. You may or may not be aware of it. So when we look at government control, when we look at the possibility of what's happening, of course, Bitcoin is not controlled by anybody. It's software. It's just running software doing what it does. So the question for you is, how do you encourage now I'm going to go a different question. What took you down the path of this? Like, was it an incident? Was it an awakening? Was it just your investigative journalism going, what the hell's going on in the money? What took you on the path of actually starting to understand what goes on behind, so that you're going, some risk mitigation? I want to own some Bitcoin.
Well, that's a great question. Right now, Bitcoin is hitting all-time highs in more than a dozen other fiat currencies, many of which are experiencing far worse inflation than we have here in North America and the United States and other countries. There is a pain point there. And I think it always helps when you have a financial or economic pain point that maybe incentivizes you to dig deeper and to learn more and to try to find a solution. For me, it was my family's background. First generation immigrants. I saw my parents work so hard, grew up without a lot of financial security. And then just as they were finally able to achieve a modest version of the American dream, as I was in high school, I was a teenager, I went off to college and they lost everything in the great financial crisis. And it was such a vivid emotional experience for me because by that point, they were in their 50s, having to start over, file for bankruptcy. I mean, there was so much shame associated with it, but also just this lack of hope. Like, how are we going to get through this? Did we make a mistake coming here and sacrificing everything we did to come to the United States, the land of opportunity, where we just lost everything, even though we were good, hardworking people who paid their taxes, played by all the rules? For me, that was a moment that stuck with me because I wondered, how could this happen? Like, what is it in this system that allows hardworking Americans to lose their home, and yet the Wall Street banks get bailed out and all of their risk taking is almost rewarded? And so I had that seed planted and I wondered, well, how does the system actually work that could permit something like this to happen? And so I think I was searching for Bitcoin, not realizing I was. And when I found it and stumbled upon it, everything became clear because I suddenly understood what had happened, how we had decoupled from sound money, and what that led to in terms of the increased gap between the ability to afford life and what everything costs. And I slowly started to see that it was monetary intervention and central banking and top down control that was impacting the system and creating a situation where the middle class was having a harder and harder time existing. And I was given a lot of hope when I realized that Bitcoin is one of the only tools that could potentially solve this. And so that's why I'm so passionate about spreading that message, because my peer group is full of very educated, smart people. We're like the most educated generation that ever was. And if you walk down the street and ask someone, how does the Federal Reserve print money? How does the government make money? What is money? What is the history of money? I guarantee you 9 out of 10 people will not know the answer. And the 1 out of 10 might be a Bitcoiner, right? Because they've taken the time. And it's just so sad because truly money is at the base layer of how all of us interact. I mean, you can't leave the house without spending $20 today or whatever currency you have at home. Everything that I'm sitting on a chair that someone produced, and there were prices that had to be evaluated and sacrifices that had to be made. I'm talking on technology that I had to expend resources to pay for. And so everything boils down to money. And if our money's broken, then our society is broken. And unfortunately, people are not digging deeper. And it makes me really sad when they choose things like convenience. When you talked about what's happening in China, well, maybe that community is safer, right? They're watching everything you do. If someone jaywalks, they debit it. What's really so bad about that? Well, it's a slippery slope. What's the next thing that they will do? What if they don't like a purchase that you made or a vote that you cast? They could literally remove your ability to survive, to have any money at all. And so I think people need to become more aware, and they need to be awakened in that way, because if we lose our freedom, there is nothing else. And freedom is fragile. Freedom is fragile, and we do not want to lose it. And again, it's always a slippery slope. One thing can lead to the next.
Well, something so you're familiar with, of course, Canada and the trucker convoy and the freedom and the lockdown and what they called the Emergency Measures Act. And they literally were shutting down people's bank accounts. And by the way, to this day, there's still people in trouble with that. So that's how much control that they have even today, let alone what they'll do in the future. Right. I'd shared a story that one of my credit cards was compromised. I use Apple Pay occasionally, and I have on my phone, of course. And as I'm having the conversation with the American Express person on the desk, and I'm saying, this is what happened. She looks at my account. Oh, she says, I see we got some transactions here. Oh, they're not yours. Got it. Da. And she says, okay, well, we're going to shut down that card right away. I understood. This is not the first time it happened for me. Like over the years it's happened. But the difference was this. She goes, I'll delete the card from your wallet. And I go, okay, I guess that would make sense. And then literally, while I was talking to her on the phone, on my phone, watching my wallet, because I'm communicating with her, boop, my card goes away. Yeah. And I'm going, wow, that's how much control they have. And this was just some operator on a credit card. And it's literally that much control is a push of a button, a click of a mouse, and boom, you're shut down. Right. Now, having said all of that, I get the sense by most people, they go, yeah, but we live in Canada, we live in the US, where, we're evolved as a culture. Our governments would never do that kind of stuff. Of course, our prime minister did such a great job of making that wrong. But I want to ask you in that, so when you look at Bitcoin, when you look at whatever, when you're looking at risk mitigation, do you see the monetary policy collapse? Now, I recently had Lynette Zhang on the call. I mean, she is like, in her world, it's not a case of if, it's a case of when. I had Mark Moss on the show. Mark said, basically they're in that camp going, the current monetary system cannot hold out. It will collapse. It's just a case of when. depending on who you talk to, it's going to happen sooner than later. But people in general have no idea of this conversation. So for you, when you look at why Bitcoin and all of the reasons behind it, but what drove that? When you look at monetary, or you look at the current monetary system, fiat currency, how do you view it? Do you see it as high risk? Do you see the inevitability of U.S. losing reserve currency status? That's a big call, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I see the whole thing as a house of cards and a big bubble, and we keep kicking the can down the road. We've kicked it all the way up to the sovereign debt level, and so the release valve is the currency, right? And everyone just has to try to outpace inflation. And they give us a number, CPI. Oh, the inflation rate is only 2%, right? I mean, 2%. Who notices that? When the reality is, what prices have gone up since the pandemic, 20% at the grocery store. Houses in the last couple of years are up in some cities 100%. I mean, how does the average person catch up with something like that? Can people just go to their bosses and say, you know what, my groceries are up 20%. Can I get a 25% raise? I really need to keep up with the inflation rate and how many units you guys are creating. I mean, it's absurd. And yet that's what's happening. And we're continually enslaving some people in society. And to your earlier point, I mean, the money in your bank is not your money. If someone can just shut it off, if a corporation or a government can just hit a switch and you have no access to it, then is that your money, or does someone just own you and they're offering you a loan, an IOU? And it's just so sad that we've gotten to this place. And this is why I think it's so important for people to educate themselves so that they don't sleepwalk into total control, feeling like, well, at least I'll be safe and convenient, right? Like an animal in a cage. Well, you've got water and you'll be safe, but you won't be in the wild. You won't be free. That's not living. And I think people really do need to be empowered more. But part of the reason I think so many people are not realizing and getting it is they are working so hard. I mean, if you're talking to people who are in their 30s, 40s, the millennials ago, I mean, their parents could afford a house on one income. It wasn't that hard. Schools were not so expensive. Healthcare wasn't so expensive. Everything was within reach. There were, if your viewers are familiar with Venice, California, you know, pristine, beautiful beach communities. Arnold Schwarzenegger has done some really interesting interviews about how he came over. He was first generation, wasn't making a ton of money, but wanted to invest, put a ton of his income into real estate. But at the time, you could buy a house in Venice, California for $40,000-$50,000 US dollars. Today, those homes are worth millions of dollars. Now, he said that he would have a neighbor who was a USPS worker, making whatever the salary was at the time, who could afford to buy a house in these beautiful beachfront communities in California. Today, could you imagine a postal worker getting a house in one of those areas? You have to be wealthy. And so something has changed, right? We've debauched our whole financial system. People just don't realize it. And they're accepting of the fact that things just sort of get more expensive every year, but they're treading water. And I think that's what's leading to so much of the frustration that we see. Social media has grown, and it provides the perfect outlet to vent these frustrations. You see young people of all ages actually going on these platforms, TikTok and Instagram and all of that, saying, I don't even know how to make ends meet. I'm spending all of my money on rent and cost of living. I have nothing to save for the future. Stretch that out. I mean, that is unsustainable. And so I think then people make the decision to elect the very policies that are hurting them, right? They're asking for handouts and freebies and please just someone come in and save me. And so they're electing people who will promise to just spend more and kick the can down the road for future generations. And again, make that wealth gap even more extreme, because ultimately people in government aren't doing anything productive. They're just spending our future generations' money. They're putting the tab on, our grandkids. And we need a fix. And Bitcoin is, again, that return to hard money for the digital world. Gold was I would be a huge gold bug and believe that gold was the answer if Bitcoin did not exist. But Bitcoin takes the properties that make gold amazing and great money and elevates them, because it makes it even faster. It makes it more auditable, more verifiable, more immutable. And so I have a lot of hope, because we do have this technological solution. And that's why I think we need to onboard everybody.
I think there's and I don't disagree. Although when I look at Bitcoin and I look at precious metals as an example, I'm also a real estate investor, and that's kind of a lot of what I do in the background. But when I look at all of it, I was listening to this a while back, Jim Rickards, and Rickards, you talked about a diversified portfolio. And he said, it used to be a diversified portfolio was you would own 30 stocks in 6 different sectors, and that was diversification. Now with what's going on in the world, diversification is you got to own some stocks, yes, some equity, probably fewer than you would have ever owned in the past, but you need to own some Bitcoin, and that's a big statement from Jim. And then you got to own some gold. That's a diversified portfolio, and you have to own some real estate. That adds to a diversification of portfolio. But when we look at what you mentioned, and I think we see what's happening in the world today, and it doesn't matter what age group really, but you talk about that 25 to 45 to 50, you look at that age group and the challenges that they face of making ends meet. There's so many people are so in it, they see the problem. Then to your point, politicians come out and say, we got you, we're going to subsidize you, we're going to give you money. It's like that socialism trap, and socialism has never worked in any country ever. Yet it is, you have the general public that are living in a problem. They are in pain and they want to hear a solution. And the solution for them is that most in Canada, I don't know what it's like in the US so much. I think it's some version of the same thing, but we have politicians going, greedy CEOs. That's the problem. It's those greedy CEOs of corporations. They're taking your money. Makes my blood boil when I hear this. It infuriates me that people buy into it. But people are in general are in pain, and that they don't understand the pain. They think the cause is I don't make enough money. They think the cause is that there's greedy CEOs that are taking all their money, and if they would just pay them more. They think that the government needs to solve the problem, when in fact the government is probably the primary source of the problem, next only to central banks or in collusion with the central banks. So really the statement that, and I think part of the message that we have to get is, you are really passionate about educating people on Bitcoin. But I think there's also got to be, and I'm not saying for a minute that you're not doing this, and that's not my suggestion, but I think there is a large message of people educating themselves on what the cause of the pain is. The cause of the pain is not that you're not making enough money. I mean, that's a result of the underlying problem, which is the breakdown of government, the overspending, the monetary policies that are in place. Do you agree with that? Do you follow that train of thought? Do you see that as part of the issue that in terms of education, that we have to provide or shine a light on?
Absolutely. I mean, this isn't a question of left versus right, red versus blue. This is our monetary system is broken. It is manipulated at its core. We do not have capitalism. We have a system that's completely built on credit. And we have a small group of people who are deciding the cost of capital. The free market, which we do not have, the free market is the best allocator of resources, but you have to have real price signals and real interest rates, not something that can be artificially lowered and all this stimulation come in, because that just leads to malinvestments and these aggressive boom and bust cycles. We have gone so far down the deep end because every time that there's a crisis, what do? They come in and they kick the can down the road and they make the problem worse. They fill up a bigger bubble. And by the end of the next, bubble round, the wealth concentration has gotten worse. People are so frustrated. And it's a great excuse. It's a perfect invisibility cloak for the policymakers to say, oh, it was the greedy corporations. It's not me. It's not us. It's not our failed policies. It's certainly nothing to do with government. And they put the blame on other things. They're putting the blame on Bitcoin right now, right? Like Bitcoin's the threat to all these currencies. No, it's their policies that have threatened the currencies, and they won't admit it. And they won't admit when they failed. And we've created a system in many nations around the world of just total government largesse. It is bloated beyond belief. Here in the United States, I mean, they're talking about these amazing jobs reports. A quarter of the jobs created were in the public sector, not in the private sector. They're low paying public service jobs. Some of them are very high paying, actually. That was something I didn't realize when I was a reporter. I would cover stories and I was meeting like superintendents or people within local jurisdictions who were making like $400,000 a year. It was wild. But we've just totally skewed everything. Government is not a productive entity. It's supposed to be, charged with law and order and policies that empower the free market and empower individual freedoms. And yet now it's just this total top-down control. And people need to break out of that. I think that people feel they know that something's wrong. They just don't know what it is. They can't pinpoint it. They're looking at the wrong causes. They're distracting us with all these social issues, right? More people, I think, have the majority of things in common. Actually, maybe they feel a little bit differently about this or that. But at its core, it's the money that we need to be addressing, not these fringe political conversations that they're trying to get us to focus on. And I hope that more people start to ask these questions. I was excited that President Trump was asked about Bitcoin last night. I don't know if you saw that, but it seems like he's changing his stance on it. A lot of these prominent figures are doing an about face and starting to be more friendly and warm toward Bitcoin. And we need to embrace it. Nation states need to embrace Bitcoin. The individual to the nation state, everyone in between needs to embrace Bitcoin for empowerment.
When we think what's going on in the world right now, Natalie, and I got a few things I want to just kind of riff off a little bit. First and foremost, we've never seen a more polarized, divisive kind of world that, whether it's US, Canada, we'll just say Western, North America for sure, it's being driven through, like, there's this really hard line of divisiveness and polarity that's happening in the world today. And, I could get into a whole conversation about why I think that's happening. I believe it's all part of an overarching plan. I know that sounds a little conspiracy theorist, but it's not. I'm not thinking in those terms. I'm just watching it unfold. You'd have to be kind of really in denial to say that that's not happening. Now, why is that happening? It's our political leaders are driving that. My point around all of this is that, how do we protect ourselves? How do we risk mitigate? Bitcoin is one of the ways to do that. The only thing I would add to this, Natalie, and I'm going to pester you until you're back on the show, because I think there's a fundamental here that we have to look at, that when we're talking about it, and I know, again, one of your passions and purposes is to get the message out around how to, Bitcoin in this case. But there's also, you speak well to young people, but I also know that there's many boomers like myself who have had to spend and have made a commitment to supporting their children. So that retirement fund that was pretty generous perhaps is not so generous anymore. All of a sudden, they find themselves supporting their kids that are 30 years old and 40 years old and helping them buy homes and helping them get through tough times. And the next thing you know, we have boomers who are not doing nearly as well as they were even 3, 4, 5 years ago. I still believe strongly that Bitcoin is an important hedge in terms of risk mitigation. And I think that's a message that needs to get to everybody. And I always enter the conversation with anybody who goes, what are you talking about Bitcoin? I go, all I would suggest to you is this: open an account, buy $25, $50 worth of Bitcoin, so you at least understand how the process is, what the technology is, what is a seed phrase? What does that even mean? How does it protect you? How easy is it to work with? Become familiar with it so you're not chasing it. But I think there's a message just overall that the first thing is that people have to look at what's going on economically and see the future. That's how I'm looking at it. And as much as we can say, well, it is the way of money, it's a way to transact, it is sovereign, it is not, doesn't have third-party risk. We can't have the government shut it down.
Right.
That message is that's good, but this really is a financial risk mitigation strategy right now, is how I'm looking at it. And am I a little bit dark, doom and gloom around what's going on globally? Yeah, I would have to say I am. I still remain very optimistic, but I'm optimistic because I believe that I'm seeing what's unfolding and I'm being able to protect my family and what we have built over the years, and at least risk mitigate. That's how I'm holding it. I'd like to hear from your point of view in terms of a message. How do you see the world? And aside, and is Bitcoin for you a hedge, or is it really an investment, or is it just like, what's the space you hold for Bitcoin?
Sure. So I really do think that we're in the middle of this paradigm shift. I think we're moving to a new system. Globally, within the legacy financial system, we are moving to a more multipolar world. I don't think that very many nation states will continue to tolerate one global reserve currency where the central bank just prints and goes $34 trillion into debt and then can also weaponize that currency and sanction, right? They're looking for alternatives. So things are changing. And there's a bit of a generational divide, right? And it's not just technological, but some people can't afford to tolerate a massive amount of volatility because they do need to make expenditures in the short run. So maybe their Bitcoin allocation is a little bit lower. It should definitely not be zero, but maybe you're closer to retirement. You know, you need to be spending the money. Maybe it's not, 50 to 75% of your account, but if you're young, I see this as the future of money. I see it far more conservative and less risky than betting on a bunch of stocks where you have to worry about the management and the products and the technology changing and all of that. There is a lot of risk that goes into investing in the stock market. And we've sort of normalized all of it because our money is so broken. You can't just put it in the bank and have it appreciate, right? You earn like 0.01% interest normally, and inflation is whatever percent. So you're actually just losing money in the bank and you're working harder and harder for money that's worth less. So you're incentivized to risk it, to invest it. Savings is different from investment. I don't really see Bitcoin as an investment. I see it as savings, which is the basis of capitalism, to be able to drop your time preference to not spend today, but save up for the future so that then you can invest it in capital and something productive. We spend by just going into debt. We create credit. That's not the same as saving. It's not taken from deferred consumption. It's made out of thin air by both the banks and the central banks. And so I think we're in the middle of this very powerful shift that will take decades, if not longer, to play out as younger generations come in and embrace this technology. And we see how it interacts with these forces of control and the politicians who want to maintain their grip and monopoly over money. But there are going to be so many implications because Bitcoin is not just an asset and a currency. It's also this powerful network that is impervious to hacking. It makes data and money incorruptible. And in a world of cyber warfare and denial of service attacks and grids going down, we need a network that we can actually trust. That is going to be the base of transacting business securely. And that is the cybersecurity of the nation. And so Bitcoin is going to be so important. And as we evolve, right? As technology has changed from transportation to how we communicate with the internet, our money is going to evolve as well. And so depending on your risk tolerance and where you are in your life and the expenses that you're going to have, you need to figure out the right allocation for you. But the wrong one is zero for any age.
I 100% agree. We've got a trip planned to El Salvador this year because I want to go check out how they're doing in the Bitcoin world. And on the surface, it sounds like it's pretty epic, the transformation that was had. A friend of yours and an acquaintance of mine, Jeff Booth, I think it was Zimbabwe, he said that he was at, and they're transacting all of the time in Bitcoin. I'm going, wow. And those are huge populations and it's happening, right? So I'm encouraged by what's going on, that they are functioning and it's going, the way it's going. And I know you got a hard stop, so I'm going to cut it off there, Natalie. And I want to just say I would really appreciate you. Normally I do a real kind of rapid fire 10 questions. I got 2 questions to just wind things down for you.
Okay.
And the first question is, if God exists, what do you want to hear him say when you get to the gates?
Oh my gosh, that was not what I was expecting.
I know.
Here is everlasting peace. I don't know.
You know what I think he's going to say? He's going to go, Natalie, you made a difference. Thank you. That's the one thing.
That would be very nice too.
I believe that's what's going to be, because you've got a purpose, you've got a passion, and you're living it. And I love that part of it. And then finally, Natalie, what are you grateful for?
I'm grateful for a role that allows me to be of service. I really am. I feel like I somehow the universe came together in the right way for me to find Bitcoin. I really do believe it's this tool for global empowerment. I believe it's a tool for the average person to have a shot to make it and not be pushed down by the forces of society that make you feel like you'll never catch up. And I want to help open people's eyes. At the end of the day, it's everyone's responsibility to decide what to do and how they're going to live their lives. But the money should be the money shouldn't be corrupted at its core. And I'm just so grateful that I've learned about this, that I found it, and now I get to share the message with others.
I love that. And I am so grateful to have had the opportunity to have this conversation with you, to have met you. And I'm really actually grateful for the work that you're doing because, I'm an old guy in this world. And when I see and listen to young individuals like yourself who are actually trying to be and trying to lead the way, trying to shine a light on the future for others, I'm
Mhm.
also very hopeful and very inspired, and I appreciate all of that. I'm also grateful for all of my listeners and my wife who puts up with me. So grateful for my family. And Natalie, thanks so much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you for what you're doing, and hope to chat with you again soon.
We're going to do it again soon, I hope.